There's something haunting about an empty dress, hanging still, untouched, where joy was meant to bloom. On the morning of June 2nd, 1901, in the quiet town of White Hollow, Pennsylvania, Margaret Cross was supposed to walk down the aisle in a handmade lace gown, the bell of St. Lydia's ringing in harmony with the start of her new life. Instead, by dusk, that same dress lay crumpled across an empty chair, and Margaret was nowhere to be found. No note, no witnesses, no signs of struggle, a packed church, a weeping groom, and a silence that hasn't broken for over a century. Some say she ran, others whisper she was taken. But the truth? It was buried long ago, if it was ever known at all. This is not just a story about a vanished bride. It's about the cracks in a perfect town and the secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. If you're drawn to real-life mysteries that unfold like forgotten ghost stories, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe for more haunting historical deep dives like this one. And if you find yourself wondering what really happened to Margaret Cross, share your theories in the comments. Let's piece this puzzle together. The sun rose with an eerie softness over White Hollow, a small Pennsylvania town nestled in the crook of the Allegheny Mountains. The air that morning was unusually still, as if even the wind was holding its breath for something yet to come. Inside the Cross family estate, a stately three-story Victorian with gables that pierced the sky like watchful eyes, Margaret Cross stood before a full-length mirror in her bedroom. Her wedding gown, ivory with faded pink embroidery at the hem, caught the morning light in a way that seemed to make the fabric glow. It had taken her mother nearly 3 months to finish sewing it by hand, and now it draped over Margaret's form with delicate finality. Her dark hair, usually tied in a modest braid, was styled into soft waves pinned with silver combs. She didn't smile, not yet. She simply stared at her reflection, eyes scanning herself as if searching for something she wasn't sure was there. Outside, the town was already stirring. Carriages rumbled past the cobbled streets. Children ran between doorways with half-eaten pastries in hand, and shopkeepers adjusted window displays, adding lace and ribbon as tribute to the day's festivities. Everyone in White Hollow knew about the wedding of Margaret Cross and Elijah Dalton. They had been the town's golden couple for nearly 2 years, ever since Margaret returned home from finishing school in Boston. Elijah, the tall and soft-spoken son of the local magistrate, had been the first to greet her when she stepped off the coach, and as some gossiped, the first to catch her heart. Their courtship was swift but steady, marked by hand-delivered letters, strolls along the town lake, and supervised dinners at Margaret's home, where Elijah always stood to pull out her chair. It was the kind of romance that felt curated by fate. Or at least, that's how it looked on the outside. Margaret's mother, Eleanor Cross, knocked twice before entering her daughter's room without waiting for a reply. She carried a small, heart-shaped box wrapped in blue ribbon, a family heirloom meant to serve as the something old for the ceremony. "You look beautiful, Maggie," she whispered, pausing at the doorway. Her voice was tight, not with sadness, but something else. A tremor of uncertainty, maybe. Or perhaps the heavy realization that after today, her youngest daughter would no longer sleep beneath her roof. Margaret turned, smiled weakly, and accepted the box, her hands trembling just slightly. Inside was a pendant that had belonged to Eleanor's own mother, a glass-encased pressed flower on a silver chain. Margaret stared at it for a long while before she fastened it around her neck. "Thank you," she said softly. Her mother kissed her forehead, lingering for a moment too long. Then she was gone, her footsteps retreating down the hall. By 10 o'clock, guests were already arriving at St. Lydia's Church. The wooden pews creaked under the weight of lace hats and tweed jackets, and the scent of lily filled the air like perfume spilled too generously. Elijah waited in the vestry, pacing in measured steps, his best man, his cousin Thomas, sitting nearby, nervously chewing on the edge of his gloves. "She be here," Thomas assured him. "You're probably fussing over the veil." Elijah nodded, but his eyes kept drifting toward the door. It wasn't nerves exactly. It was something closer to unease. He had received a letter the night before, unsigned, typewritten, and slipped beneath the door of his family's home. It read, "Do not marry her. She is not who you think." There were no fingerprints, no ink smudges, no explanation. He had torn it in half and tossed it into the fireplace before his father could see. But the words had clung to him through the night, like smoke in his lungs. Back at the Cross estate, the house was beginning to feel hollow. Margaret's sisters had already departed for the church, and only the maid, Lillian, remained behind to help her with her veil. Lillian had worked for the family since Margaret was a child. She was older now, grayer, but still sharp-eyed and quick with her hands. She pinned the lace to Margaret's hair, murmuring compliments and old German superstitions under her breath. But Margaret wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on the garden outside her window, where the rose bush seemed to sway, though there was no breeze. "Lillian," she said quietly, "did you ever feel like you were about to make a mistake, but it was too late to stop?" Lillian paused. "Everyone feels that way when they're about to change their life," she said. "It doesn't mean it's wrong." Margaret nodded, but her lips pressed into a tight line. A few minutes later, she asked for a moment alone. Lillian hesitated, then nodded and stepped out, closing the door behind her. It was the last time anyone saw Margaret Cross. At 10:52 a.m., when the carriage arrived to take her to the church, the maid returned to the room and found it empty. The dress lay across the armchair, the veil still pinned to the wooden mannequin beside the dresser. The pendant was on the floor, the chain broken. The window was closed. The door had not been locked. There was no note, no sign of a struggle, no blood, no noise. Just an open room filled with silence. Lillian called for her, first calmly, then frantically. Eleanor came running, followed by the butler. They searched the house from attic to cellar. Every room, every closet, nothing. Eleanor collapsed into a chair, clutching the pendant to her chest, whispering her daughter's name as if repeating it could summon her back. Word reached the church by 11:30. First a whisper, then a wave of panic. The guests stirred, murmuring in confusion, heads turning toward the vestibule. Elijah stood frozen as his father approached, whispering something into his ear that made the groom's face drain of all color. The ceremony was delayed, then postponed, then quietly canceled. The church bells never rang. Instead, the sound that filled the town was the slow, uncertain shuffling of guests exiting the churchyard, eyes downcast, conversations hushed. Some whispered scandal, others tragedy. A few murmured the unthinkable had she been taken, or worse, had she done it herself. By nightfall, White Hollow had shifted into a different kind of quiet. The town square emptied earlier than usual, and no one seemed eager to talk above a whisper. At the Cross home, gas lamps flickered behind drawn curtains as the family gathered with constables and neighbors. A search party was assembled, torches lit, names called into the forest, dogs sent along the creek's edge, but nothing turned up, no footprints in the garden, no torn fabric, no scent trail. It was as if Margaret had stepped out of her room and vanished into thin air. The townsfolk tried to rationalize. Perhaps she ran, cold feet, a last-minute escape from a life she didn't want. But her family didn't believe it. Margaret wasn't impulsive, and she'd left behind everything: her bags, her letters, her jewelry. The next morning, June 3rd, the sheriff issued a formal statement. Miss Margaret Cross is to be considered a missing person under mysterious circumstances. Posters were made and placed across the nearby towns. Horses were dispatched as far as Pittsburgh with notices. The newspaper The White Hollow Sentinel printed a special evening edition titled, "Bride Vanishes on Wedding Morning. No Clues in Cross Mystery." Photographers arrived. reporters from neighboring counties, some looking for truth, others for spectacle. The Cross family declined interviews. Eleanor refused to eat. Margaret's father, Abraham, took to sitting on the porch with a loaded shotgun and a faraway look in his eyes. Inside, the wedding gifts remained unopened, the cake untouched, the dress folded back into its box. Elijah did not return to his family's estate. Instead, he remained in the churchyard long after the last guest had gone, seated on the front steps of St. Lydia's. Some say he cried. Others say he simply stared at the gravel path leading up from the road as if waiting for her to appear in the distance. He was the only one who had received the anonymous letter, and yet he never told anyone about it. Not that night, not even years later. It would remain his burden, his secret, one that ate at him in ways no one fully understood. 3 days after the disappearance, a local boy named Samuel Hartley found something peculiar near the old quarry about 4 miles east of town. It was a single shoe, half buried in mud, with pink embroidery at the hem, the same pattern Eleanor had sewn into Margaret's wedding dress. But there was no sign of Margaret, no prints, no body. Just the shoe, and nearby, a silver hair comb broken in two. Authorities searched the area extensively. The quarry had been abandoned for decades, overgrown, riddled with fox dens and steep drops. But nothing turned up. The shoe was bagged, labeled, and locked away. Margaret's mother couldn't bear to look at it. And then the rumors began. Some said she had run off with someone, an old lover, a secret suitor, a man she'd met while in Boston. Others claimed she was pregnant and feared the scandal. But those who knew her well said otherwise. Margaret was gentle, deliberate, and kind, not the type to flee without word, not the type to vanish. The maid, Lillian, insisted she had seen something that morning in the garden, something she couldn't explain. A man, perhaps, or a shadow, something wrong. But when pressed, she couldn't recall his face, or if it was even a man at all. Only that the roses moved when the air was still, and Margaret seemed afraid. The town held a vigil a week later. Candles were lit on the church steps, songs were sung, and Margaret's name was spoken aloud like a prayer. But the wind did not answer, and the mystery remained. Rain came on the 4th night. Not a storm, but a slow, weeping drizzle that darkened the cobblestone streets and soaked through the soles of searchers' boots. The torches went out one by one. The posters that had been nailed to the bakery wall curled and bled ink, Margaret's painted face running down the paper like a ghost in retreat. Most of the town believed the search was still active, still organized. But by then, people were only pretending. The sheriff, a round-shouldered man named Walter Graves, had no leads, no witnesses, and no experience with disappearances. White Hollow was a town of stolen pies and occasional drunken fights, not vanishing brides. Walter lit his pipe each morning and tried to look official, but his eyes were tired, his uniform stained, and the ache in his hip was getting worse. When he met with the Cross family, he avoided Eleanor's gaze. She asked the same question each day. "Have you found her?" And he answered the same way each time. "Not yet, ma'am, but we will." Inside the Cross estate, the mood had shifted from hope to a brittle silence. Margaret's father stopped speaking altogether, retreating to his study, where he sat surrounded by unread books and fading photographs. Eleanor kept to the sunroom, staring through lace curtains at the overgrown garden, her teacup trembling in her hand. The house staff moved quietly, as though any loud sound might shatter what was left of the family's composure. Margaret's older sister, Beatrice, had returned from Philadelphia 2 days after the disappearance. She took over managing the household with rigid efficiency, organizing meals, fielding visitors, and responding to inquiries with the tone of someone who had seen too much death to be surprised by one more. But at night, she wept into Margaret's pillow, her fingers tracing the stitched initials on the bedspread like a rosary. What troubled the town most wasn't just the absence of evidence. It was the absence of logic. No one had seen Margaret leave. There were no signs of entry or exit, no forced doors, no broken locks. The maid, Lillian, stood by her account. Margaret had been in the room at 10:30. The room was empty by 10:52. 22 minutes in which a woman could have walked out the front door, climbed from a window, or simply ceased to be. Elijah Dalton was questioned twice, though never formally. He offered no information beyond what was expected. No, she hadn't seemed afraid. No, she hadn't mentioned wanting to leave. Yes, he loved her. Yes, he would have married her, even if she were hiding something. When asked if Margaret had enemies, Elijah simply shook his head. But his eyes, those tired, stormy eyes, never met the sheriff's. As rumors deepened, White Hollow fractured beneath its polished veneer. It began with whispers in the marketplace little barbs passed between vendors. Then it spread to the schoolhouse, where children began reenacting the bride ghost during recess, taking turns vanishing behind trees. At the church, attendance dipped. St. Lydia's pews sat increasingly empty as townsfolk grew wary, as if the building itself had become cursed. Some began pointing fingers. They accused Elijah of betrayal. They accused the Cross family of secrets. They accused Lillian of negligence. And then, finally, they turned to each other. Old feuds reignited. Suspicion made neighbors into strangers. The sheriff, under pressure to show results, turned his focus to Margaret's time in Boston. Perhaps she had brought something or someone back with her. He wrote letters to the finishing school she'd attended and received a response a week later. The headmistress described Margaret as bright, introspective, prone to melancholia, and curious about the occult. That last detail made its way into the town's gossip circuit with astonishing speed. The word occult drew out all kinds of darkness. Suddenly, Margaret wasn't just missing, she was dangerous. Perhaps she had dabbled in something forbidden. Perhaps she had summoned her own disappearance. Old stories were dredged up. Tales of women who spoke to the dead, of secret rituals, of shadowy things that moved between walls. None of it was confirmed. But none of it was denied either. 3 weeks after Margaret vanished, a letter arrived at the Cross estate with no return address. Eleanor opened it in the parlor, her hands shaking. It contained only a torn scrap of newspaper, an article from 1899 about a different woman who had disappeared on her wedding day. Same circumstances. Same eerie silence. The woman's name was Evelyn Moore. She had lived in a village called Belle Haven, about 50 miles north. There had been no body, no note, just a locket found hanging from the church gate. Eleanor dropped the paper, her breath catching in her throat. She called for Sheriff Graves. He took the article, but found no connections, no suspects. Evelyn Moore's case had gone cold in less than a month, just like Margaret's seemed to be. But there was someone in White Hollow who remembered Evelyn Moore, an elderly woman named Cora Bishop, who had once lived in Belle Haven before moving south. She had worked as a seamstress for both families. When questioned, she recalled both girls vividly. They had the same eyes, she said. Not the same color, but the same. Stillness. Like they were looking past you. She spoke of strange dreams she had after working on Evelyn's dress. Dreams where doors opened without sound and voices whispered her name from behind mirrors. No one took her seriously. Most dismissed her as senile. But that didn't stop the town from growing colder. The Cross family decided to hire a private investigator, a man from New York named Cyrus Bell. He arrived in a dark gray suit and a fedora that never left his head. His presence unnerved the locals. He asked questions that cut too deep. Who was Margaret, really? He'd ask. What didn't she want people to know? He dug through letters, examined her belongings, interviewed everyone from her piano teacher to the stable hand. What he found was both too much and not enough. Margaret had kept a journal during her school years. Most of it was mundane entries about the weather, books she read, and homes she missed. But one passage stood out. In an entry dated March 3, 1899, she wrote, "I saw her again in the mirror. She was wearing my dress, smiling with my mouth. But it wasn't me." Cyrus showed the journal to Eleanor, who nearly collapsed. Margaret had never spoken of visions or hallucinations. She had never shown signs of mental illness. But the entry was unmistakably hers, and it was real. Cyrus began to wonder, was there something more to her disappearance than just fear or foul play? Had she believed something was watching her, following her? He spoke to Beatrice, who confirmed Margaret often avoided mirrors in the house, especially the one in her room. She said it made her feel duplicated, Beatrice recalled, as if she wasn't alone. Cyrus took that information and had the mirror removed, just in case. The maid Lillian refused to touch it. "It's not the glass," she said softly. "It's what's behind it." Soon after, Elijah received a second letter also unsigned. This time it read, "She's still here, but not where you're looking." It was postmarked locally, which ruled out a hoax from Boston. Elijah handed the letter to Sheriff Graves, but said nothing else. He was seen less often around town. He stopped attending church. He stopped speaking to friends. Some said he had fallen into despair. Others believed he was hiding something. At night, lights flickered from the attic window of the Dalton estate, strange, rhythmic flashes, as if someone were sending signals into the dark. On July 14th, a month and 12 days after Margaret vanished, a woman was spotted walking along the tree line near the Cross property at dawn. She wore a long white garment and moved with unnatural stillness. 2 boys delivering milk saw her and ran home screaming. When authorities arrived, there was no one there, only footprints that led nowhere, vanishing abruptly in the grass. The boys were questioned. One insisted it was Margaret. The other said her face wasn't right, that it looked like her, but like she'd been forgotten by the world. Their parents moved them out of town that very week. By now, White Hollow had changed entirely. The air was thick with unspoken fears. No one walked alone after dark. Some boarded up their windows. Others left town altogether. The bakery closed. The schoolhouse lost half its students. And every Sunday, St. Lydia's remained locked. The bell tower was silent. Margaret's name became a curse whispered by children and avoided by adults. Even the birds seemed to have grown quieter. The forest no longer echoed with song. One evening, Eleanor Cross walked barefoot into the garden. It was nearly midnight, and the roses had overgrown their trellises, twisting up toward the sky like reaching arms. She wore her daughter's pendant, newly repaired, and held a lantern in one hand. She whispered something into the night. Only the wind heard her, and knelt beside the largest rose bush. The next morning, her dress was found soaked with dew. Her eyes were wide open, her lips blue. She lived, but she never spoke again. The air in White Hollow changed after Eleanor Cross fell silent. Something shifted, not in the weather or the season, but in the people. A community once known for summer fairs and autumn bonfires now became a place where people crossed the street to avoid eye contact. Doors that once stayed open now latched early in the evening. There was a collective understanding that something unnatural had nestled itself into their town, and it had used the disappearance of Margaret Cross as its entry point. Even the trees along the edge of town seemed to lean differently, as though listening, as though waiting. The Cross estate became a monument to that silence. Eleanor no longer spoke, no longer wept, no longer blinked for long stretches. She sat beside the rose garden most days, whispering in tones no one could hear, stroking the petals like they might answer her back. Beatrice, still sharp and determined, took control of the household fully. She dismissed half the staff and insisted the estate remain locked from sundown to sunrise. She forbade mirrors, covered the portraits, and banned reporters from the property. But her steel facade wore thin by late August. She began keeping a journal, a habit she'd once mocked in her younger sister. It began as a chronicle of days, meals, visitor logs, but the entries darkened. "The house is breathing," she wrote on August 22nd. "It exhales through the floorboards." Then later, Margaret's scent returns to her room at night. "It's the rose water. I smell it when I pass the hallway. Sometimes I hear her humming, or someone who wants me to think it's her." Still, Beatrice never told anyone. Secrets in White Hollow had become currency. And fear? That was just the cost of staying. Cyrus Bell had returned to New York briefly, but the letters Beatrice sent him kept getting stranger. Eventually, he came back in September. He looked older, though only 2 months had passed. His eyes were bloodshot. His left hand trembled when he poured tea. "I've been dreaming of her," he said to Beatrice during one of their meetings. "Not in the way you think. These aren't dreams, they're interruptions." He described seeing Margaret in rooms that shouldn't exist, hallways that led to dead ends. Her dress always the same, always wet, as if she'd just stepped from a lake. When she turned to speak, her voice never matched her mouth. "It's like hearing a violin scream," he said quietly. Beatrice didn't laugh. She just nodded, then placed Margaret's broken hair comb on the table between them. "She's still here," she whispered. "She's not finished." That night, Cyrus stayed in Margaret's old bedroom. He insisted, said he needed to feel the atmosphere. At midnight, Beatrice heard him shout. She ran upstairs, finding him half collapsed against the wall, pale and sweating. "She was at the window," he gasped. Her hand was on the glass. But when they looked, nothing. No prints, no fog, no Margaret. Beatrice helped him back to bed, but he didn't sleep again. He left the next morning without saying goodbye. A week later, he sent a telegram from New York. "It was never about what happened. It's about what we let inside." It was the last anyone ever heard from Cyrus Bell. Some say he returned to the city and checked himself into a sanatorium. Others claim he vanished on a train platform somewhere in upstate New York. His suitcase found sitting on a bench, untouched, Margaret's journal tucked inside. With no answers, no leads, and no resolution, the townsfolk turned their attention to protecting themselves. An unspoken pact formed among the people of White Hollow. Children were no longer allowed near the woods. Weddings were held during the daytime only, and no longer in June. St. Lydia's bell was removed entirely. After reports that it rang 3 times at 3 a.m. with no one inside the tower, several families quietly moved away, citing health reasons or a change of pace, but no one believed them. And those who stayed, they changed too. Smiles became rare. Church hymns were sung in minor keys. And every now and then, someone would swear they saw a woman in white walking past their window, always silent, always just out of reach. In late September, a traveling priest named Father Vincent arrived in White Hollow, claiming he'd heard rumors of unrest and was sent by the diocese to bless the ground. He was met with resistance, suspicion, even hostility. No one had asked for his help, but he insisted. One evening, without invitation, he walked to the Cross estate with a satchel of oils and incense. He spoke to no one, performed a short ritual in Latin near the rose garden, and left without comment. That night, the garden caught fire. The flames were unnatural blue, not orange, and cold to the touch, according to the stable hand who tried to stamp them out. They burned for 4 hours and left no damage, no ash, not even a scent of smoke. Just silence. And when morning came, the roses had grown taller, wilder, thorns like claws. No one ever saw Father Vincent again. Elijah Dalton had, by now, become a shell of the man he once was. He no longer shaved, no longer walked into town. He stopped answering letters and turned away visitors. He was last seen in October, standing alone at the lake where he and Margaret had taken their first photograph together. When the leaves turned red and began falling like confetti from the maples, his estate was found empty. Inside his bedroom was a stack of unread letters, a single photograph of Margaret folded neatly in half, and a final letter addressed to no one. It simply read, "If I follow the silence, maybe I'll find where she ended." His horse was found grazing near the edge of town 2 days later. Elijah was never seen again. By winter, the Cross estate had fallen into partial ruin. Pipes froze, shutters collapsed. The once manicured lawn turned to brittle weeds. Eleanor remained in her trance-like state, now confined to a wheelchair. Beatrice, though stoic, had begun speaking less and less. She no longer kept journals, no longer spoke to neighbors. Some say she started walking the halls at night, stopping at each door, listening for movement, whispering names into the dark. When asked why she hadn't left, she replied once, flatly, "Because if I do, she'll follow." That single sentence was all it took for the town to finally close its gates. Literally, the entrance to White Hollow. Once, a simple wooden arch was boarded up with nailed planks. A sign was hung, "Private property, no visitors." It remained there for years. Sheriff Graves retired in November. He left his badge and revolver on his desk, packed his bags, and moved east without ceremony. He left behind a file with Margaret's name on a thin, weathered, with more questions than answers. Inside were the letters, the photograph from the quarry, and a single note in his own handwriting. "I don't think she left. I think she fell through." No one ever knew what that meant, but it was enough to keep people from speaking her name aloud for the next decade. By the end of 1901, White Hollow no longer existed in the way it once had. The people remained, the building stood, but the town had become a memory of itself. It lived in whispers, in shadows, in silence. Children born that year were never told the full story. The name Margaret Cross was erased from ledgers, from plaques, even from the family Bible, but her room remained untouched. Her pendant stayed in its box, and her dress ironed and folded was placed beneath her bed, waiting. And then came the snowfall. The first real snow of December arrived with a weight that felt deliberate. Thick flakes fell for hours, blanketing the town in silence once again. But this silence was different. It wasn't the hush of fear or reverence. It was the kind of silence that follows a story's final chapter, the kind that lingers when nothing else can be said. Some said they saw footsteps in the snow that led from the Cross estate to the church steps' bare feet, too small to belong to any man. Others swore they heard St. Lydia's bell ring once, long after the mechanism had been removed. A single chime, faint, final. In the years that followed, White Hollow became a place of avoidance. It vanished from maps, rebranded by nearby counties as unincorporated land. The road signs were taken down. The train stopped making its regular stop, and yet, people still passed through. Hikers, historians, ghost hunters. None stayed long. They all reported the same feeling, that the town wasn't empty, just forgotten, and that someone something was still waiting there. Margaret Cross was never found. No remains, no confession, no final answer. Her disappearance remained one of the most chilling unsolved cases of its time. But those who lived through it didn't remember it as a crime. They remembered it as a turning point, a rupture, a tear in the fabric of their world through which something slipped and took her with it. Whether she ran, fell, or was pulled is a question no longer asked. Because in White Hollow, everyone knows the truth they can't speak, that Margaret never left. She simply stopped being seen